Okay, let's start. Happy 2021, everyone who's listening. Welcome back to the Hot Politics Lab. I'm pretty sure that we'll be keeping this online-only format for a good amount of time in 2021. But I also hope that somewhere later this year, we'll be going towards a hybrid form where at least some of us can sit together, or at minimum we can have a beer afterwards. I'm very happy to announce the first speaker of this year, Ursula Daxecker, who is my colleague at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. But she is an associate professor at the Petkov Group, the Political Economy and Transnational Governance Group. And she is an expert in studying violence around elections. And I think when I saw sort of the first work by Ursula on this topic, we were mostly thinking about faraway countries, India, but violence and elections have seemed to have been commonplace also in very mature democracies. So it's a super relevant topic. And Ursula has received last year, I think it was, or maybe already 2 years ago. Time flies when you have an ERC starting grant, right, Ursula? And so she received this grant for particularly this topic that she will talk about today. Ursula is doing a lot more experimental work recently. And so that's one of the reasons that she's here today. Without further ado, I want to give you the floor, Ursula.
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Gijs, and thanks also for the opportunity. It's really great for me actually to present to a group of people who are so well versed in political psychology, communication, and experimental methods, which is more of a recent transition for me. So as Gijs already mentioned, I'll be presenting a pre-analysis plan for a survey experiment that we're hoping to field later this year today. And as already mentioned also, this pre-analysis plan is part of a larger project where I've received funding from the ERC. So what I will do today in my presentation is I'll first introduce that larger project and then I'll transition into this pre-analysis plan. And as you can also see here on this slide, the survey experiment is going to be co-authored with Hanne Fjelde. So to tell you a little bit, about the larger project, so the title of the ERC project is Elections, Violence, and Parties. And I officially started the project in June of 2020, so it's still relatively recent and early stage. Now, I think it's important for us to study the relationship between elections and violence because, as Gijs also mentioned, we actually see quite often still violence in elections. So if we look at the best data that's available, then about 1/3 of all elections in developing countries still have deadly violence. I could also show you some recent examples here. So, you know, if we looked at the most recent election in Nigeria in 2019, then there was a lot of violence in that election. We could also look at India, which is particularly the empirical focus of the project that I'm presenting today. At least in some parts of India, the most recent parliamentary elections were also quite violent. And then also, you know, obviously I have to mention this now, I'm sure all of us are still processing what happened in the US last week when a violent mob that was incited in that violence by Trump and also important Republicans essentially tried to assault the electoral process and tried to overturn the outcome of what was a free and fair election. So in terms of the questions that this ERC project asks, it focuses on 2 questions. And one of these questions is really about, well, what explains when and why and how elections turn violent? And for this portion of the project, there is definitely already a substantial literature that would tell us something about the conditions under which some elections would turn violent while others do not. However, a gap in this research that my project aims to fill is to focus more specifically on the role of political parties and also partisanship. And it's actually quite interesting that this has not been a major emphasis in the literature on elections and violence, because we also know that political parties, even in countries that are electoral authoritarian regimes, but particularly in countries that are democracies, whether that's semi-democracies or full democracies, we know that parties are really important for mobilization, right? Mobilizing people to vote. Now, if we accept that parties have the organizational capacity to mobilize voters, then we could also think of situations where they might use that same capacity for illicit strategies, including violence. And that is really the core goal of this portion of the project, to establish the conditions when parties would choose one or the other strategy. Now, there is some recent work and also some older work that touches on this that I will very importantly draw on in developing this portion of the project more. However, this requires a lot of theory development, and because the project started in June, I don't have results on this portion just yet. But for the second question that my project aims to answer, I actually have some empirical results already, and then also the pre-analysis plan that I want to present to you today. So this portion of the project would then look at the question of, well, how does violence that happens in elections actually affect citizens? How does it affect voters? And here again, we already know some important things, right? So among the findings that we have on this literature, we know that violence in elections reduces turnout, reduces support for democracy, and also reduces confidence in the electoral process. At the same time, we also know that it increases support for authoritarian forms of government. But what has been emphasized much less is, again, this question of, well, what is the role of parties, and particularly partisanship, in mediating some of these effects? Because if we think about it, then violence during elections is generally strategic. So, for example, incumbents might target opposition voters. Now, if incumbents target opposition voters with violence, then we would expect that violence to have differential effects on those voters versus supporters of the incumbent. So it's straightforward to see how partisanship and the role of parties might play a role also for this relationship. And so for this second question of the project, I already completed an experiment that asked about the effect of violence and partisanship on how people perceive the quality of elections. And this, here we have finished the analysis and we have a complete draft of the paper. And I actually want to talk about those findings for a little bit, because it helped create, it basically gave us the inspiration for the current project. So I'll talk about that briefly, and then I'll move into the pre-analysis plan that I am especially interested in getting feedback on. So for this first study that we've already completed, examining people's perceptions of election quality, the key question that we were interested in here is to look at how information about violence affects people's perception, and specifically how partisanship might mediate this effect of information about violence. And we think that's an important question, because if we think about this from a rationalist perspective, then we would expect that information about violence should always reduce citizens' perception of election quality, because violence undermines key dimensions of the electoral process. However, what we're arguing, in contrast, drawing on theories of motivated reasoning, is that actually when people are exposed to information about violence, how they respond to it would really be a function of the partisan claims or the partisan slant of that information. And more specifically, what we're arguing is that when people hear information or receive information that blames co-partisans of being responsible for violence, then they would actually try and counter-argue that information and might counterintuitively become more confident in the electoral process. And so this is, along the lines of disconfirmation bias, right? So basically, if a co-partisan is accused of having engaged in violence, then that would contradict your assumptions about who is responsible for violence. And for that reason, you're trying to counter-argue this evidence. On the contrary, we would also expect that when people are exposed to information blaming opposite partisans of being responsible for violence, that they would actually become more critical, because that would be consistent with their expectations. And so in terms of the micro-level mechanisms driving this, we have some speculations, but I don't have time to go into those. But how we did this empirically, we carried out a pre-registered survey experiment after the last national election in India, and we carried out this survey in one state in particular, which is West Bengal, which is a state that is known for experiencing violence in the electoral process. And I'm showing you here a headline from this election that illustrates that, well, for one, that substantial violence happened, but for two, also that the nature of that violence was partisan, meaning that the TMC, which is the state incumbent party, and the BJP, which is the national incumbent party, were actually involved in a lot of these violent clashes. And so just a quick summary of our findings here. So on the left, you see the treatment, the vignette that we exposed respondents to, which basically describes a violent event, and then claims or alleges that one or the other party was responsible for this violence, varying randomly only the name of the party. And on the right-hand side, you can see our findings, which show in a nutshell that this hypothesis that I just explained was actually supported, where we find that if citizens are exposed to information blaming the TMC of violence, then supporters of that same party actually become more confident in the electoral process, engaging in this kind of disconfirmation bias or counter-arguing that we hypothesized. Now, you will also notice perhaps that for the BJP, for the other main party involved, we didn't find the same relationship. And I can say something more about why we think that might be the case, but in the interest of time, I want to now move on to the pre-analysis plan. And so basically, the bottom line here is that people are, under some conditions, willing to not just ignore, but actually update in the wrong direction when we expose them to information about real violent events. We model these events after real events, or the vignette after real events. So this made us then think about, well, what about misinformation? In some ways, actually misinformation, right? So information that isn't accurate, it might be even easier to convince people that that information is accurate, considering partisan cleavages and considering these dimensions. So that's really the main intuition of this particular project, where I'm really excited to get feedback from you. So we're at the stage now where we have a fairly rough draft of a pre-analysis plan. Because of school closures, we're a little bit further behind than where I was hoping we would be at this stage. But I still think it's a great stage to get feedback on. But so basically what we're interested in is to examine how hostile misinformation affects people's beliefs and attitudes, and then in particular how partisan cleavages, but also other cleavages, might mediate some of these effects. And when I say hostile misinformation, I'm really talking about misinformation that targets either in-groups or out-groups, or that is aimed at in-groups or out-groups along pre-existing partisan, ethnic, or religious cleavages, so pre-existing disagreements that exist in society. And we know from research that these kinds of cleavages tend to be particularly salient during elections. Elections are periods of great uncertainty, but elections are also moments where political actors might strategically use this kind of misinformation for electoral benefits. And there is, of course, a lot of research on this already, and I'm sure people attending this webinar are very much aware of this, but we think an important empirical contribution that we want to make with our project is to essentially explore these effects outside of the United States, which is overwhelmingly where research has focused. And to give you a bit of an idea of the kind of misinformation that we find in the empirical context that we're interested in. So we're doing this experiment in India, and here is one common often shared piece of misinformation, which claims that cow urine cures cancer. Now, it might sound crazy to you, but I've read a survey that says about 50% of the Indian public believes this. And you might think of this as crazy misinformation, but that is maybe somewhat harmless, but actually it does have both religious and partisan undertones. And religious because cows are revered in Hinduism, so it's clearly aimed at Hindus. And we also know that the BJP is a party that gets a lot of support from right-wing Hindu nationalists, so it also has some partisan undertones. Okay, so in terms of what we know about misinformation and how it shapes attitudes and also beliefs, I think these are two great review pieces. I think you are fairly familiar with this literature, so I will be very brief in my overview, but I think we can broadly distinguish between two ways of thinking about the effects of misinformation. And one of these would be to focus on the characteristics of the message and the content, and then, you know, look at various dimensions of that. And the one that's most relevant for our project is, you know, partisan or ethnic or religious slant of the message. And then, in addition to that, people have, you know, examined extensively heterogeneity, in particular for partisanship. So, based on this literature, we develop three main hypotheses, and we also anticipate that we may perhaps, you know, need to cut down on these hypotheses, given that, you know, there's usually limitations in terms of the variations that you can explore, especially with, you know, a not so large sample. So one dimension that we want to explore is the source of a misinformation message, where trustworthiness is something that's been emphasized in the literature, but also in work on the Indian context. Then we're also interested in the veracity of misinformation. And here our expectation is that more blatantly incorrect misinformation may more often be shared, but may actually, you know, less often be believed than more mildly incorrect misinformation. And then finally, I think probably the theoretically most interesting hypothesis is the third one, where we're interested, you know, well, the hypothesis maybe needs some revising, but what we're interested in is really in examining both, you know, the independent effect of partisan slant or targeting of partisan outgroups and the effect of targeting religious outgroups. But then we're also interested in exploring the relative effect of one or the other, where our intuition is that actually, you know, messages targeting religious outgroups are more effective at convincing people that they're correct. And then we're also interested in exploring individual heterogeneity, because of course the, you know, the characteristics of respondents would matter for how this plays out. Okay, so just very briefly, some context on the misinformation environment in India and also West Bengal in particular. So in India, social media targeting at the very micro level is crucial for elections, in particular using WhatsApp as a tool. And parties are very organized in this. They go to the very micro level, to the polling booth level, and essentially, you know, figure out, okay, who votes in this polling booth, and then target people along caste, partisan, religious, socioeconomic, all kinds of indicators, put them in WhatsApp group, and then, you know, bombard them with messages, basically. What's also interesting is that there's an asymmetry in this among parties. The BJP, the national incumbent party, clearly is the dominant party in being able to use social media along the lines I just described, and in turn also is the party that has an advantage in using it for misinformation. And I think it's interesting, right, because we see some parallels here with the US, where also we see on the right much more misinformation than on the left. Okay, now, how does West Bengal fit into this? We think that conducting this survey experiment in West Bengal is actually a difficult case for our hypothesis, because historically the BJP has been very weak in the state and didn't have a lot of electoral support. So that should make it harder to find support for the kinds of, you know, the third hypothesis that I talked about earlier. And also historically, partisanship was the main cleavage rather than caste or religion, which tend to be the dominant cleavages in other states in India. And so about our research design, you know, I mean, still obviously quite a bit of this is subject to change, but what we're envisioning is a post-election household survey. And we want to carry out this survey after the election because, you know, showing people misinformation during an electoral campaign could affect outcomes, right? Could affect how people make decisions. And I think that's not the business we should be in, even though from an analytical perspective, it would be more interesting to do this during the election. We're planning a household survey because it's pretty much impossible to do a representative survey in India if you use an online panel, but I'm open for discussion on this point. And we expect to field it in June. And then in terms of our experimental setup, we want to vary the dimensions that I just talked about. And yeah, so I can talk more about those, but I actually have an example of the third variation that I want to show you, to give you some idea of what we're thinking of here. And then I should just mention briefly, right, ethical concerns. I already mentioned, why we want to do this after the election. But another reason to do it after the election is that it's better for the protection of respondents and enumerators, because the electoral context in West Bengal can be quite hostile and quite violent. So, showing potentially, upsetting information to respondents, I think is safer to do after. But in thinking about these ethical concerns, we pretty much, try to follow the 2020 guidelines from the APSA, which I think are very useful in talking about, protecting respondents, minimizing harm, and also, how to deal with deception. On this last point, deception, we're also leaning towards using actual misinformation, because otherwise, yeah, we're more concerned about deceiving people into believing misinformation that is not actually accurate, but that isn't real misinformation, which sounds crazy to say, I guess. But okay, so to show you some examples of the kinds of messages that we're interested, that we potentially might be using, on the left you see an anti-Muslim message, and here basically what this message claims is that Islamic organization that is prominent in India has links to Al-Qaeda, and this is not true. And it's a fairly subtle misinformation treatment, which I think also makes sense given that, this is a quite sensitive topic, but it would hint clearly at being against Muslims. And on the right, you can see a message that targets the incumbent party in West Bengal, so the TMC, and basically claims that the police in that state used bombs to break up a rally by BJP supporters. Again, this is very much untrue. They were using tear gas to break up an illegal rally, but this shows you some examples of the kinds of misinformation messages that we would like to use. But I think also, we need to wait much closer to the election to definitively settle, I think, on a design. But I'm happy to hear your feedback on that. So I'm probably out of time already, but I just want to mention a couple of points for discussion where I would especially appreciate your feedback. So I mentioned that we're inclined to use a household survey, but of course, an online panel would have advantages, the primary one being that we could do a much larger survey if we used an online panel, and then we could expand the survey beyond West Bengal, right? I mean, so the primary reason for why we're now settling for West Bengal is not that it's the only state we're interested in. There are 3 other states that are holding state elections at the same time, so we could expand to those other states if we did it online. But of course, the main trade-off here would be to lose representativeness and basically end up with a sample that is very much biased in favor of BJP supporters. So as long as that would be okay from an experimental design, that would be okay. But yeah, we're debating that. And then another point where I appreciate input is whether vignette design is actually the best idea here, or whether we should think about a conjoint design. Platform choice, and here by platform I mean WhatsApp. Obviously, it would be an artificial environment in the sense that we couldn't send people actual WhatsApp messages, but we would show them a WhatsApp message. I think WhatsApp would make the most sense from the perspective of this being the tool of choice for political parties in India, and also the tool of choice for the most Indian citizens, most widely used one. But maybe there are trade-offs here too. And then I'm also thinking about, well, right now we're focusing very much on who believes and who shares misinformation rather than on more downstream attitudes. And I think, there are real disadvantages on focusing on more downstream. It's hard, right? I think it's harder to focus on these downstream attitudes, even though it might be for us, theoretically more interesting. But yes, so I think, one key contribution of our study will be that the very limited work that has been done on India uses either, convenience samples or online panels that are very unrepresentative. So we think, that would be one reason to speak in favor of keeping with the household survey. Now, it won't be surprising to you that, one key implication of my research is that violence and hostile misinformation are bad. But we also think that our work shows that they're bad in ways that we didn't realize. So a lot of the work on violence in elections has focused on how that violence depresses turnout, etc. But an implication of our work is also that it actually can radicalize people and can make some people more extreme in their positions. And so I will end on this note, and I look forward to your questions and comments. So thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. As always, but maybe you've forgotten a little bit in the year 2021, we'd like to ask you to post your questions in the Q&A box, so not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box, and then I will read them out to Ursula, and Ursula will provide you an answer. So, oh great, there is already a first question. Yeah, the first question is from Ozan Oktay. How would you interpret the relationship of populism and violence, between populism and violence?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I have to admit, I'm not a scholar of populism, and I'm not particularly well versed in that literature. So maybe I can punt this question to one of the other webinar members. But I mean, I'd say, populism, or, using having a populist ideology and openly supporting or engaging in violence, there's still quite a few steps in terms of the causal chain of what needs to happen. So I wouldn't want to make the claim that populism, that it's kind of like, one step removed from violence. But I think certainly and I don't think Trump is very much a populist, right? I think that was the concern in the beginning of his term, but based on the little that I've heard from colleagues studying populism, is that they found that his presidency actually wasn't particularly populist, that the way he governed and the way he communicated didn't really fit populism, although I couldn't explain why that is, but I do recall reading that. So I think, what we have seen, right, that extreme partisanship that actually, goes from calling rhetorically for violence to actually practically playing out violently, that certainly is more feasible than many of us thought possible, right? I mean, I was worried about violence in the US elections, but I didn't think it was particularly likely, and I'm obviously not happy that it played out this way. But I don't know if someone who knows the populism literature better wants to add on to this. But yeah, that's where I would leave it at.
All right. Well, if we have time, we'll probably call in Matthijs Roduin, who is obviously our most well-known populism scholar here today. But first, I'd like to give the floor to Kristine, who has a question and has the right to speak himself.
Thank you a lot for the presentation. It was super interesting. I have a question. Can you tell us a bit more about your first hypothesis and how you're going to use it in the experiment when it comes to trustworthiness of the source? I was wondering, what's the ranking of the three different trustworthiness sources you mentioned, the leaders, the family, and the neighbor? And I'm especially interested how you want to use that in the experiment, especially, for instance, when it comes to family. How do you portray a message as being from a family member in that experiment where you don't know, what's the family member of that person who fills out that survey, right? How are you gonna do that? And what's the ranking in those three categories?
Yeah, thanks. So the ranking, I think, would go from most trusted to least trusted, right? Where someone who is, part of your most immediate social network, well, not just, social network, offline and online, not necessarily online, would be family, right? Would be most trusted, to then going to a local leader, to the neighbor being least trusted. And I mean, you're perfectly right that like to do this plausibly, right, is going to be very difficult. But I mean, we would say hypothetically, right? Hypothetically speaking, if you receive this message from a family member, and then afterwards ask if they believe this message, and our expectation would be that the one from the family member would be the most trustworthy one. But of course, we not knowing, right, respondents, we could mimic this. We couldn't make this perfectly plausible. So it's definitely, I think, not it's definitely a hypothesis that we probably need to think more about. I think potentially it's interesting, right, because at least in the work on misinformation that I've read on India, I don't know to what extent this is also the case in the US. It says that basically how much you trust the person forwarding the message is hugely important for whether you then spread it to others. And that people's perceived importance of, okay, so if they get a message from someone who they consider important, they're much more likely to pass on that message. So I think it is substantively relevant, and maybe it would be better for us to vary, let's say, the partisanship of the local leader forwarding the message. I think that would both potentially be more plausible and, keep us away from, this issue of, how do we mimic this for a family member. So there are some other options for us to think about, but I do think substantively it's interesting because in the qualitative work, which is really the only work on this that's out there, it's very much emphasized that how much you trust the person matters. And I think that also makes WhatsApp different from, Facebook or Twitter, which are much more open-facing and outward-facing, where networks, I think, personal networks, or the perceived importance of a network may be much more relevant on WhatsApp. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, and I think, right, there is a question from Femke van S. Just a small immediate response to the trust issue. Why not integrate a question about whom respondents would trust more in terms of political information?
Yeah, so as a question to ask after the experiment, is that what, Femke, if you want to elaborate, then that's fine, but that's how I understand it. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I mean, actually, I also think, one thing that we're going to do that I regretted not doing with the first study that I briefly presented is to also ask people why they chose a particular answer, right? Like why they chose to say that they believed misinformation or not. I mean, maybe that also has risks, but I think it could be quite interesting and allow us, right, if we then get lots of questions, from reviewers on like, okay, well, why do you think people really did this? Like, what's the micro mechanism, which a lot of times it's very difficult to get at with these kinds of experimental designs. So that would be a good idea to do. But I think a question on trust, right? I mean, so clearly I didn't say this and I should have, but basically this experiment would be embedded in a larger survey where we would also ask a lot of descriptive information about the kind of misinformation environment that people are embedded in, what kind of misinformation they get exposed to, and also lots of other questions, like demographics questions about political attitudes that we often see in surveys. So a trust question, I think, would make sense. Yeah.
All right. Gijs, I think you also had a question, but if...
Yep. I wanted to ask you to elaborate on this difference in the finding between TMC and BJP in the first study. I'm curious what your explanation of that is.
Yeah, and actually I can stop my screen sharing. I should do that. Yeah, sure, happy to elaborate. So basically, I think one important point is to note that So for the BJP voters, right? So when BJP voters were exposed to information accusing the BJP of violence, we also don't see that people update in line with a rationalist model of opinion formation, right? So they also don't become more critical of elections. So in a way, you know, you could say, well, maybe they're just ignoring it. So in terms of, you know, figuring out why it might be that we see this asymmetry, a couple of things we've explored in the paper. One is, and we think that's the most convincing one, you know, and this, you know, I mentioned this briefly when I talked about the second experiment. The BJP, right, historically is not a strong party in West Bengal. And so people who voted for the BJP this time, it's for many of them the first time that they supported the party. And even though those respondents said that they trusted a lot, right? So basically the measure of partisanship that we use is how much they trust a particular party. And if they say they trust the party very much, then we call them as BJP or TMC partisans. Basically, you know, in the last election, they may have voted for the communists, they may have voted for the TMC. So, and, you know, parties on a quite different ideological end of the ideological spectrum. So we're suggesting that basically these people aren't as committed partisans as TMC partisans, which is a party that was active in West Bengal politics for many more years than the BJP. Now we'll explore a couple of other explanations. I mean, one possible alternative explanation is that the BJP, that the TMC may have had an advantage in exerting violence, right? So maybe if, you know, the TMC was the party engaging in most of the violence, maybe that's why those voters respond differently. But when we look at this empirically with the data that we have on violence that happened, there's no evidence for that. And there's one other explanation that we investigate. Yeah, whether it's some kind of winner-loser dynamic, right? Because the BJP won the election nationally. So you could say, well, maybe those voters were happy with the outcome. So if you show them additional information, that's not going to move them. But when we look at the direct effect of whether BJP partisans are actually more satisfied with the election outcome, we don't find any evidence for that. So we tried to get at this empirically, and based on that, we conclude that basically it's a question of, you know, intensity of partisan commitment.
Just a short follow-up question based on my lack of knowledge on India, but as the incumbent party in the West Bengal, do you think that might have an effect? That maybe are the elections organized at the local level so that the local government can be held more responsible of the process? Yeah,
that's a good question. But no, not in this case, right? Because it was a national election. And actually, that's another reason for why we think, you know, the incumbent engaging in most of the violence seems very implausible, because the national government even sent the army to protect the election and provide election security. And so state police, right? So the police are really under the state authority. It would be very hard for them to engage in violence when so much attention is spent on the electoral process. But no, yeah, they're organized nationally. For a state election, it would be quite different, right? I think it would be a much more plausible hypothesis for a state election.
All right, thanks. There's a question from Matthijs Rodan. Like to ask a question about the slant of hypothesis free. Could you tell us a bit more about your reasoning regarding the mechanism here? Why would respondents exposed to information on ethnic, religious outgroups be more likely to be affected than respondents getting misinformation about political outgroups? Does it have to do with the nature of these messages or with the context, the political situation in West Bengal? Let's just first stick to question one of Matthijs, Ursula.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it myself too. Yeah, so I think the rationale behind the hypothesis is that in in the developing world, generally speaking, people think that ethnic or religious affiliations are more important than ideological commitments for how people identify as partisans. And that's really why I think this is an interesting and relevant hypothesis, right? Because it kind of allows us to capture the relative extent to which, what drives people are really these allegiances to ethnic or religious groups versus it really being about partisanship. And so I think, if we conducted this experiment only in other Indian states, then it wouldn't be a particularly surprising finding, because in those other states, I think it's generally accepted that religion or caste plays a very powerful role in how people identify as partisans. Now, of course, there are Hindus who are not BJP voters, right? But almost all BJP voters are Hindu. So from that perspective, we think that this is particularly interesting to ask in West Bengal, where historically, actually, the cleavage was really party rather than caste or religion, where every aspect of social life, whether it's cricket or your union, had a partisan affiliation. And that also has to do with the fact that the state was run by communists for 30 years. Now, obviously, right, saying that this is interesting for West Bengal makes it less interesting potentially for other parts of India. But I do think it's also somewhat, I'm also thinking about this as interesting from the perspective of looking at US politics, right? Because if we look at US politics, then that's also a bit of a point of debate. To what extent is partisanship really about partisanship, or to what extent is it about feeling part of a racial group, right? Where I think, there's quite some work now that says that, well, it's actually a lot more about these ethnic aspects than we've been willing to admit. And so maybe it, helps the appeal of the paper to a US audience, even though it might weaken it somewhat to a local Indian audience. But I think, even from a more theoretical perspective, right, this is an important question, right? To what extent are people moved in to believe misinformation or not by their partisan commitments versus their ethnic or religious commitments? And that's really what we're trying to get at here. So I hope this somewhat answers your question. But I think, your second question is actually a response to the question that was asked earlier. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, Ursula, I think also you partly answered one of my questions, and that is you started with why India, and one of the arguments you had in the talk was, well, it's interesting to do this beyond the United States, but I think now you've raised actually a theoretical puzzle that has a broader theoretical implications for this literature, and then it's a context where this happens, and that indeed may weaken for West Bengal people who have particularly interest for West Bengal, but I think it would broaden the appeal for the broader project in the broader literature, that you might avoid even getting the question why India, because you have an interesting theoretical puzzle with these competing identities, and that you can study in the case of West Bengal. So that to me adds an extra layer of why India would be an important case. I have another question for you, and that is in terms of the representativeness of the sample, and the sort of the question you had about should I go for the household or the online panel. You haven't talked so much about sort of the sample size and power the power you need to detect the effects of interest, but I would personally, maybe you can say a little bit more about that, what the trade-offs there to be made. And I think personally I would advise to always go for a sufficiently powered study, and if that means that you have to go for the cheaper online panel, that I think would be a trade-off to make. But I think maybe you can say something more about what you're planning and how these trade-offs are made.
Yeah, so I have to admit I'm not particularly well versed in things like, okay, what's the sample size I would need for this in this power analysis that we should conduct. We didn't do this with our first experiment, and we should have. And if you have a, yeah. So I'm not really sure what would be needed and what I would need to do this. I mean, I think with the online panel, well, I mean, it's a trade-off, right? But I mean, I would just be worried that if it's not representative, then we again have no systematic idea of who really believes in misinformation. So it's a choice that we have to make, right? And I don't think it's really fair to ask you or the audience to make those choices for us. But I brought it up because, you know, it's things we've discussed as authors. But so, I mean, I also think, you know, there's something to be said for the representativeness. Well, there's obviously a lot to be said for the representativeness, but there's also a bit of the narrative in India that it's really the illiterate or the poor who are most susceptible to misinformation. And I don't think that's very likely to be the case, but we don't really know because, you know, the studies that have looked at misinformation, none of them have used representative samples. And very few have actually done any kind of surveys, but it's, you know, the studies I know, they use convenience samples, you know, basically Facebook samples. So it also depends, right, on, you know, with the hypothesis, which ones we settle on or decide to really use. I think, you know, for the third hypothesis, if we're really going to try and figure out, okay, to what extent is it about partisanship versus religion, then maybe it's okay to have the online sample, right? Because, you know, then our sample is going to be biased in favor of BJP supporters. And then I don't think that would be so much of a problem because, you know, then those people would be most crucial to have. But if we want to also be able to say something about, okay, you know, is it really true that it's the poor? Or, you know, to what extent does trustworthiness matter? You know, to what extent can we say something systematically about the misinformation sphere, then that's much more difficult. But because a household survey is so important, right? I mean, we have to choose one or the other. We unfortunately can't do the larger representative survey across several states.
Oh, and I think, you know, it's in the US or like some of the work that's done in terms of whether or not experiments generalized from online samples to population-based samples have been done, but I'm not aware of how, whether or not this is done in India. You know, that trade-off is difficult to make, but I also don't know how deep your pockets are with the ERC in terms of maybe you can even split it or wait. Gijs, do you also still have a question? In a different channel, you posted a question, or was that a comment?
Yeah, but there's also a question from Isabella.
Oh, right. There is a question from Isabella. Thanks. Yeah, so there's a question from Isabella.
Can I ask one quick follow-up to what you just said? When you said splitting it, would we do both but then also in the same state, and to also be able to compare, right? Like what?
Yeah, you know, I don't know how deep the pockets are, but I could see, you know, that these papers have been relatively influential in U.S. politics of, you know, do our experimental effects generalize in online samples compared to household samples? And I could especially imagine in countries where it's really expensive to collect some of this data, which I could imagine like a state like West Bengal being an issue. I think it could be a potential extra contribution you have there. But, you know, that would be a relatively costly study to do as well, because you would have to probably field them at the same time, which is, but there's some of this work on sort of does MTurk generalize in the US that has been helpful for other people. So it could be a service, but again, I don't know, you probably have 100 ways of people having creative ideas of how to spend the money on your ERC. So that's a trade-off to make yourself. Let's go to Isabella's question. Hi, Ursula, really interesting research, thanks. I also had a question about the first study you presented, and I might have just missed this because my connection was quite bad. Is the confirmation bias you find driven by people rating an outcome as more legitimate if there was violence from their side, or is it that there is no effect if electoral violence comes from their own side, but a negative effect on legitimacy only if violence comes from the other side?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, so Well, it's both, right? So we find both disconfirmation bias. So if we interact the treatment with co-partisans, so TMC violence with a TMC partisan, we find that they become more confident in the outcome of the electoral process. But if we do it the other way around, right? So if we interact BJP violence with TMC partisanships, right? So a TMC partisan is exposed to violence by opposite partisans, then we find that they become more critical of the electoral process. So it's both disconfirmation bias in the first scenario and confirmation bias in the second scenario. And for the BJP, it never matters, right? So BJP partisans, whether you expose them to co-partisan violence or opposite partisan violence, we never find a significant effect. I think that was the question, but let me know, Isabella, if I didn't get it.
All right. Wait, is there now a question, or is that still Isabella's question? Oh, that's Isabella's question. So I think I have another question for you, Ursula. Or Gijs, do you have a question?
I wanted to give some feedback on the one of the questions you asked on whether to go for a vignette or a conjoint, because it seems to me from the hypothesis there isn't really so much variation in these different messages that you theorize about. So in that sense, I'd say if there's so little variation, that then it is also feasible to do a vignette study. But if you're thinking about a message where all the different components are sort of integrated, so then there's a lot more variation. Then a conjoint setup might work, and it might also be cheaper, and literally, and you need fewer respondents to get a sufficiently powered results. So I guess my question really is, how much variation is there in the messages?
Yeah, I mean, the way we've envisioned it right now, I mean, so this is also a question, right? I mean, I showed you two examples of, okay, this is an anti-Muslim versus this is an anti-TMC message, but I'm also not sure whether that actually works, right? Because then there's always going to be so much that's different about these messages that any other aspect of it could be what's driving the result, or at least that's what I would worry about. So I'm also thinking that we probably have to choose a misinformation message where we can keep everything the same, except, but I'm not really sure how to do that, right? Where we can still vary religion and partisanship slant, but keep everything the same. Yeah, I mean, at this point, we're exploring misinformation messages, and I also think, we have to wait, right, to choose one, because I think we should be asking people about a misinformation message or a type of misinformation message that was actually salient during the election, and we don't know that yet, right? What's going to be salient? I mean, we have some ideas, I think, based on previous elections. But I think we might have to be creative there, and I think it might be necessary to do that, because otherwise I think we run into all kinds of problems. People saying, oh, it's because you used the word Al-Qaeda, and the messages were very different, right? So that doesn't really answer your question, but is something else that I think we're aware of. But in terms of, like, would we want to vary? I think potentially, right, we could vary a lot more. And maybe that's what we need to focus on. I mean, we could integrate in the message, right? Who is the sender or who is the source? And then we could, if we vary partisanship on that, well, I don't know, is that believable, right? Because not any message could come from any partisan or outgroup. And then that's also tricky, right? Because we wouldn't expect, these messages to look the same. But yeah, so I think we have to work more on, like, what exactly would be the treatment, right? And how could we really vary those dimensions? But that's helpful input for that choice. So thanks.
I'd like to ask you a follow-up on that, Ursula. To what extent? So I admire, on the one hand, the goal to say, first of all, think about ethics. I think this is really important in this type of work, because we know that correction of misinformation is hard. At the same time, following up on your answer to Gijs, so to what extent are you worried about potential pre-treatment effects, in a sense that people have been treated by the misinformation that you select? And then how is that gonna affect the treatment effects that you find? Because maybe these are misinformation stories that people have been exposed to, so they respond very differently to it, or maybe they don't respond at all because they have already been exposed to it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's a trade-off, right? Because yeah, we should probably just come up with something sensational if we want to avoid these pre-treatment effects. But then if we're inciting violence, right, or someone being beaten up, then that's not worth it, I'd say. But, I mean,
I agree with that, Ursula.
You're definitely right that this is an issue. I mean, I guess, you know, for members of the out group, right, we could assume that it would be quite novel still, because I think if you're Muslim, then you're not in WhatsApp groups that, you know, target, that send messages that are anti-Muslim in nature. I mean, but then there I'm also more worried about the ethical concerns, right, that as a Muslim you might find it really hurtful. And so yeah, I also have some concerns about that, but for the out groups, right, we would be less worried about the pre-treatment effect, I guess. But then again, that would seem to speak in favor of actually doing the household survey rather than the online panel, right? Because there we would get, my guess would be 70-80% BJP voters, but maybe that's not high enough to be worried about that. But yeah, that's a good question. I mean, are there any guidelines on this issue of pre-treatment effects that you're familiar with? I mean, in the US context, do people always come up with artificial misinformation? Because of that, it's also not really possible, right?
Two thoughts. I always tell people to read Rune Slothuus's paper in 2016 in political communication, and Gijs is laughing because that's true. So I think that's the paper that is it's on party cues, but it's a nice way of thinking a little bit about this issue. The second thing, and this is mostly what I've seen in the ethics board, what I see from people in my department that do this, they do go for things that are relatively salient, but they come up with their slightly own version. And then I torture them as a member of the ethics board to think about the debriefing, hard and long, and you know, then that's what we should be doing. But you know, it's always a degree of a, like, do we succeed in making sure that these misinformation beliefs are corrected. So for one, we did recently on misinformation about immigration and Corona in Germany. You know, that's pretty salient, and so there's trade-offs there to be made. But that's what I see other people do. So they do actually start to come up with salient issues, but then give their own angle to it.
Mm-hmm. Is there, if I can just ask, is there work on debriefing? I mean, because, you know, I have some doubts, right? I actually think corrections don't work for misinformation. I really want them to do, especially for, you know, misinformation along the lines of what I talked about, right? Because that's really about prejudice that people hold. So I don't think any kind of correction is really going to change people's minds. But that would imply also that debriefing is going to be hard, right? If corrections are hard, debriefing should be hard. And as
a member of the ethics board, I should say on camera probably that I believe that we correct this misinformation. But if you ask me as a researcher, I'm not 100% sure if that's true. I think, I don't know, you know, there's a big literature obviously in the US on this sort of correction of misinformation, but it might also be, say, conditional on issues. I don't know that literature too well, to be honest. Probably talk to Jason Reifler about this. I'm sure if you reach out to him, he would probably give you some good ideas.
He's the one who originally came up with the backfire effect. but I think there's been a piece, I don't know who wrote it, but where they literally tried out 100 different treatments and correction treatments. And I think on average, there is no backfire effect. And in some cases, there is an effect where people do actually update, but it's quite rare.
Is it COPOC, the BJPS, or not?
Yeah, maybe that's the one. Yeah. Okay.
We have to round up.
We can continue to talk, but we'll also round off the public part. Thanks a lot, Ursula. When I see you again, you will get this beautiful Hot Politics Lab coffee or tea mug, or you can smuggle a beer into it, or some schnapps maybe. Super interesting talk, quite a different topic than what we usually cover, so that's and quite a different geographical context too. So that's been particularly exciting, I think, as an addition here today. Let me announce our plans for the next few weeks. So next week, Friday from 3 to 4, our standard time, we have Lior Schmick-Grotz from the University of Cambridge, and she is a psychologist who works really at the intersection of politics, psychology, and neuroscience. And she's going to talk about ideology and group formation. Going to be a very exciting talk, I think, by a up-and-coming young scholar. Then the week after that, we have the PhD talks with Lynn Fick, talking about the personality of the unelected. And I guess that's bureaucrats then, Bert, or you don't know what the unelected are? Okay. I guess they are bureaucrats.
Politicians.
Yeah, but those are elected.
Yeah, but some don't get elected. Right?
Okay, maybe. Okay, yeah, well, that could be
the losers, I think.
Loser person. Lynn Fick from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology on loser personality. And the other speaker is Tristan Klingelhover with his super fascinating research on politicians and emotions. And he's currently at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And that's all for this month. And of course, we have a program in February, and you can check that on our website. So that's it for today. Great to see you again. Hope to see you next week. Stay safe, healthy, and get drunk tonight.